flick up on the screen that says. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this latest UK in a Changing Europe lunch hour, where we're going to talk about the summit yesterday and what it means. I've been joined by two of our hardy perennials, Catherine Barnard from the University of Cambridge and Jonathan Portes from, in fact, the office next door, and also by Kitty Donaldson, Chief Political Commentator at the iPaper. Kitty, thank you so much for joining us. Real pleasure to have you here. And as ever, put your questions in the Slido. Vote for the questions you want me to pose to the panel. Those of you who've been to these things before will realise that's no guarantee of anything, but we might as well try. And just to kick us off, as we always do, with a very sort of softball question, and I'll start with you, Kitty, if I may. What's your major takeaway from the summit yesterday? What struck you most?
Actually, the thing that struck me most was quite a small thing. It's when they were standing on the stage together, Alberto Costa, Ursula von der Leyen, and Keir Starmer, and both of the European leaders referred to him as Dear Keir. And I felt that was a kind of, it wouldn't have said Dear Boris or even Dear Rishi. So I thought that was very sort of totemic in a way of sort of explaining how things have moved on slightly, or not even slightly, quite a lot since they recognise Starmer as a Remainer, as a pragmatist, as a technocrat, which most European leaders are, I think. I don't think that's unfair to say. And even with the warship and so forth, I thought that was a small moment that spoke volumes.
Interesting. I think we did have a Dear Rishi, actually, with
did we?
With the Windsor Framework.
Oh.
Yeah.
Well, we had two yesterday, so they've, that's inflation for you.
Yeah, and it rhymes, so it's better.
Exactly.
Catherine?
I thought when Kitty was saying a small thing, I was going to say that's actually reflective of the content. It's not actually a lot of stuff. There's not many pages. There are essentially three buckets or baskets, if you like. One is the deal on defence and security, which is the more substantive part of the text. And that will pave the way for the UK having access to the 150 billion euro SHAPE fund. That's for defence procurement. And I thought that document actually was broader than I'd been expecting. The second basket or bucket is about the common understanding. And that covers those areas which still need to be negotiated, of which there are quite a lot. Importantly, energy, access to potentially access to the single market in electricity. It also covers SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary, and things like youth exchange, the old youth mobility. And then there's a third bucket, although it's not absolutely separated, of things where the can is kicked down the road, of which mutual recognition of qualifications and touring artists are good examples.
So actually, there's quite a lot yet to be negotiated. I was struck when Keir Starmer spoke at the presser that he gave the impression that some of this stuff was done.
Quite the contrary. I mean, the language already shows that pretty clearly, that it ain't done. I mean, you can see the language of exploring the participation of the UK in the EU's internal electricity market. There's an awful lot that needs to be swiftly explored.
Right. Okay. And Jonathan, last but not least.
Yes, I mean, I agree with Catherine, and this is all very much agreements to agree. So I think the key thing is whether the sort of high-level political goodwill that Kitty rightly referred to is translated into instructions to officials down the line to actually get on, make this a reality, and indeed hopefully make something rather bigger than the declaration would suggest, rather than cutting back on it. I mean, I think that remains to be seen. The real test is whether, having got this sort of political momentum behind it, both Starmer and the Commission can translate this into actual delivery, to something that actually makes a meaningful difference to businesses and to people.
I mean, on that, the government's bandied around some numbers for what this means in terms of the economy. So I suppose two-parter for you, Jonathan, as the resident economist. I mean, one of those numbers plausible, but two, are they the sort of numbers that people will feel, recognize? I mean, are people going to say, "Oh, this is better"? I mean, they're not, are they?
Well, so the number that the government has put out, it was £9 billion, which turns out is 0.3% of GDP by 2040. And that is consistent with the sort of modeling exercises we've seen before, that, you know, we're talking relatively minor gains resulting from on agri-food and on resulting from integrating with the UK, with the EU's energy market. I think it's also worth noting that the sort of the downsides of being outside the EU's market for energy and the carbon border adjustment mechanism could have been quite significant. So in some sense, maybe a small upside, but you're also averting potentially a larger downside. So perhaps give them some credit for that. More generally, though, I think, you know, it is not unreasonable to say that the numbers that you get out of simply modeling the reductions in trade barriers here potentially understate the positive impact. There are clearly impacts on business confidence, and this is where I think you need to see this deal in the context of the deals with both the US and perhaps even more importantly in some ways with India. You know, what is happening is that the UK, it seems to me, is playing, or the Keir Starmer is playing a pretty dreadful hand that he was dealt, really rather remarkably well. And the impact of that on the UK's image, international position, and on business confidence is arguably significantly positive and has perhaps more of an impact than these models would suggest. So I think I would be inclined to say that, you know, are we going to feel this in our pockets next week or next month? No. Does this mean that the UK is on a significantly and noticeably better economic track than it would be if we hadn't done all of these deals? I think actually arguably yes.
Okay. And Kitty, the Prime Minister's addressed the PLP yesterday evening, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, is the party happy with him?
I think so. Actually, I don't think Europe particularly featured actually in the PLP last night. I think there was more questions about windfall U-turn that we reported over the weekend, that the welfare payments and what's the other one? Child poverty. And I think to the point about improving food prices, that's going to take years to come in. The whether or not the OBR, Office for Budget Responsibility, can score any of this in the autumn, Rachel Reeve, to show that her growth figures are getting better, that's an open question. And there are all sorts of wide open questions about this, like for instance, not just on the e-gates, you know, whether you have to brandish your passport when you go through customs in Europe, which of course everyone who's travelled to Europe recently finds incredibly boring, and it's a bit like the sort of the punishment of, I always think of it as the Brexit punishment. You know, you will not go to the beach for another hour because you've got to stand here in this really sweaty queue waiting to brandish your passport. And talks on that are just starting, so it seems unlikely that if you go to France or Spain this summer, you're going to be ushered through on a red carpet. So there's quite a lot of this sort of in the future, which actually seems to be kind of like the theme of the Labour government. I think they're putting down quite a lot of building work foundations for stuff that hopefully for them will show fruition in 2, 3, 4 years' time, just when we're going into the general election.
Catherine, as our resident lawyer and mobility expert, just talk us through this thing about the e-gates, will you? Because I mean, apart from anything else, the one thing that struck me is we're going to be quite dependent on the goodwill of the French to make this work, aren't we?
Did you say just overfishing or more generally?
No, on the e-gates specifically.
Oh, the e-gates. Right. So e-gates, in fact, we don't know a great deal. And what we do know is that once the new biometric data stuff comes in, we'll be able to use e-gates, assuming member states allow us and assuming they've even got e-gates. Steve Pears makes the point that in fact we were going to be able to do this anyway down the line, so this is not too surprising. In terms of the perennial question, are we going to have to get us a stamp in our passport? I know you like them, Anand, but
Jill Rutter, who's obsessed with stamps in her passport, she says she's not going to travel to Europe again unless she's guaranteed a stamp.
Well, indeed, it may be that you have to get rid of the stamps going forward, because they'll keep it. I mean, the stamps are there to count how many days you've been in under the 90 out of 180 day rule, and of course they may well be able to do that electronically going forward.
And are you confident that there? I mean, so part of the story is it was going to happen anyway. Again, Keir Starmer seemed to give the impression that this would apply from tomorrow, which it clearly won't. But ultimately, it's going to be up to each individual member state to decide whether to, or to what extent we can go to use these gates. Is that right?
That's what it seems to say. I mean, the stuff about e-gates it's in the second bucket I mentioned earlier. It's not. It's in the bit agreed to be agreed rather than the bit on a done deal. And so the detail is very, very thin, because this whole document on the future, the roadmap document, as Ursula von der Leyen called it, is quite brief.
Okay, and I mean, we've got a few questions on the politics. So just to come to you, Kitty, and it's very, very striking. The sort of the sense of deja vu about the tone of the debate, the tone of a lot of the headlines.
Yeah.
Was really, there we go, was very, very striking. Is there a market for this, do you think? I mean,
that is a really interesting question, and one that actually I've been grappling with over the last few days when I've been thinking about this. If you look at some of the polling, particularly younger people think we should go back into a customs union. I don't think there's been any sort of polling on like whether people should stop banging on about Brexit. And I think if you did poll that, most sensible people would say, can we please just stop talking about this? It's so boring. Even geeks who are watching this podcast might be sort of thinking, have we not moved on from Brexit? If you read some of the papers today, you'd think we were in like 2017 or something. And Boris Johnson popping up and describing the Prime Minister as a gimp for being in the EU's orbit, which is absolutely ridiculous. Given that the UK has secured notable concessions. For instance, the Commission accepted that the European Court of Justice can actually be kept at arm's length, and then use the independent arbitration system instead, and we'll get decision shaping rights similar to Norway's. So Boris Johnson and David Frost failed to secure anything of the kind on the Northern Ireland Protocol, where the European Court of Justice has full jurisdiction, and actually nor did Dear Rishi secure any of this in the Windsor Framework. So instead of crying Brexit betrayal, I think actually not only are they on the wrong side of public opinion, they're making a mountain out of a molehill of this entire process.
But I mean, to go back, does this have consequences? I mean, it's a very strange state of affairs, isn't it? Because I remember when we did our event post local elections, one of the things John Curtis says is that the electorate is divided along Brexit lines. I mean, the electorate is Leave versus Remain, but that's bizarre because Brexit simply isn't an issue.
But it plays out in different ways. Yeah. It now plays. So I think the European Court of Justice is this season's Brexit. It's
right.
spring summer 25, right? It's ECJ rather than Brexit now is an old-fashioned word, and I think it's played out in the debates on immigration, on small boats, on ECJ, like I said, and the sort of the thinking about sort of DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion is a sort of more modern manifest of the kind of left behind versus sort of woke London liberal lawyer. That's the kind of new version of that we're seeing in the mid 2020s versus however long ago we had these debates before.
Okay, Catherine, you're going to come in then?
I would be very happy to talk about the role of the Court of Justice.
Well, yeah, if you could talk about the role of the court. I mean, let's just talk a bit more generally about this sovereignty thing, shall we? Because there's two elements to that. I mean, one is oversight, which may or may not be the court, and the other is this notion that the UK somehow gets a say in the areas where it dynamically aligns. What do you make of all that?
So there's a couple of things that note. It seems to me, I think there are three areas where you've got dynamic alignment. And in respect to dynamic alignment, that's where the UK agrees to keep up with EU legislation. There is a reference to the fact that the European Commission should consult the UK at an early stage of policy making, or in the case of energy cooperation, an appropriate UK contribution to decision shaping. Now, a couple of points to note. First, this is a far cry from having a seat at the table. This is merely a discussion at a very early stage. And I think one of the interesting points on this is, of course, this is one of the things that the Windsor Framework was trying to do for Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
And it's been something that in Northern Ireland has been very difficult to deliver on. Yeah. And quite what mechanism actually this entails is not as clear as it might be. Of course, this is very much a skeletal document. Now, the plus is it is a recognition that the UK will be bound by rules over which it has no direct say. So this always leads to the accusation of rule taker versus rule maker. This does not make it rule maker at all. On the other hand, the business community really wants the UK to follow EU rules because it's our biggest market and they want to sell into it. And therefore, they have been de facto following these rules, even if they're not legally obliged to do so. And so that's point one. Point two, it will be an interesting exercise to see how this is legislated for, not least how it will impact upon the devolved. Because some of this stuff will have an effect on devolved, especially the SPS stuff. And then thirdly, there is a role for the European Court of Justice, as Kitty just said. And for all the cries of betrayal, what you see envisaged here is essentially a similar package to what you find in the withdrawal agreement in respect of disputes over the operation of the withdrawal agreement, i.e. arbitration committee. And if the arbitration committee thinks there's a point of EU law at stake, a reference is made to the European Court of Justice. And that withdrawal agreement model, remember that's the Article 50 text, the divorce text, that withdrawal agreement model looks like it's being transplanted into the three areas where there will be a dynamic alignment.
Does this mean that there'll be an end to the not for EU labels on food in supermarkets?
Well, that presupposes that there will be a proper deal on SPS. But I think the noises coming out of Northern Ireland are quite positive that this will ease a lot of the issues with the GBNI border.
I mean, I was going to say, it's worth saying that both on agriculture and energy, there are massive advantages for Northern Ireland.
This is a big win for Northern Ireland, both in economic terms and I guess also in political terms, in terms of sort of diffusing some of the sort of noise around the anomalous position of Northern Ireland.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Hence the talk about sausages, which were a bit of a flashpoint in the debate.
And I mean, to be fair, I think that's been somewhat understated, perhaps, in the press. I mean, given how much, to the extent to which Northern Ireland, frankly, sort of both poisoned the whole debate for some years and to some extent shaped the ultimate nature of the settlement. The fact that this goes quite a long way towards solving that should be regarded as a pretty considerable achievement, right?
Yeah, I think that, and I would say as politically, of course, it will make things easier, I think, for the DUP to participate in some of these arrangements, because at the moment, of course, they see Northern Ireland as separate and kept out of mainstream GB arrangements. So I think there may be a political win there. And actually on SPS, it is worth bearing in mind, although there is a lot of cries of foul over fisheries and the 12-year deal, it is worth bearing in mind that the fishing sector has suffered very badly from Brexit in respect of the paperwork required to be able to bring UK fish into the EU market. Fish is much less fresh than it used to be because of the delays in getting the paperwork done. And so there are some swings and roundabouts even over fish.
I mean, I have to say that of all the political reaction, the sheer effrontery of the some politicians and some of the Brexit supporting press in claiming that the same deal which Boris Johnson signed, in 2020 that was presented as a triumph at the time is now somehow an abject, the same deal in terms of quotas, and as you say, a better deal in terms of actually being able to sell the bloody fish, is somehow presented as a surrender. It's just, it really, the exercise in doublethink here is really quite remarkable.
Can I just come in on that?
Absolutely.
Which is actually, you're right in that the Brexiteers are always going to jump up and down and say it's betrayal, whatever happened. But the sort of mistake or misstep that the Prime Minister's taken and Labour's taken, the government's taken, is not to pitch roll their part in it very well politically, so that you've got this sort of big document just dropping without any of the kind of outriders persuading people, the kind of people, people that these like sort of Labour greybeards to go out and sell this stuff, not only to the public but to the party. And this youth mobility scheme or whatever we're calling it, youth fund scheme, whatever, I don't know what phrase they came up with.
Experience.
Yeah, experience. Yeah, okay. Venga Butt Abroad scheme. They did what they didn't do was say, this has been the worst kept secret across government. I was writing 6 months ago, it's going to happen, because people in government would be like, no, it's not happening, and then we'd be like, but it is though, right? And they'd be like, so that's not breaking any source confidence, I don't think, but we all knew it was happening. Just say so, for God's sake, right? Just and start getting people used to the idea, and they didn't do that, and then suddenly you've got a whole bunch of kind of negative headlines.
Yeah.
And you've got, day one is fish, day two will be all the other stuff that's not going to work out, a bit like a budget, like all the other stuff that's falling apart. If you'd sort of, I know negotiations were going up until the 11th hour, but you could have done some work around the edges to try and things up a bit, I think.
I'd add two comments to that. I mean, the first is I think it's probably slightly worse than you made it sound, Kitty, because not only did they not pitch roll, but insofar as they talked about it, they made this link between youth mobility and freedom of movement a thing. Now, clearly, they're utterly different things. But even when I hear youth mobility now, my mind automatically goes to freedom of movement, because every single time it's mentioned, the Labour minister would say, we are not returning to freedom of movement, as if there were a link. And I think that's productive. But I think
I agree, and I think that this sort of reflects the sort of dysfunction, that which I of course have written about and talked about a great deal, sort of complete disconnect between the idea that on the one hand, as Keir Starmer said, the government's number one priority is growth. Growth, living standards, public services, our number one priority is making people feel better off. And at the same time, our another overriding priority, contradiction obvious, is reducing migration. And you see that in the government's simple unwillingness to confront the fact that there are trade-offs here. And so you get clearly what, you obviously know better than I do, Kitty, but clearly what was happening here was that the Home Office was just refusing to sign off on anything, no matter how minor, that implied there was going to be a youth mobility scheme, until it was actually forced to at the last moment, and therefore they couldn't say anything about it. Just as similarly, on the India deal, which was an absolute triumph for British economic diplomacy, in my view, an absolute triumph. It's very, very difficult to do deals with India, as everyone in the trade world knows, and the UK got a pretty good one. Yet dominated by the fact that they had not prepared the fact that there was always going to be some compromise on this rather arcane issue of social security contributions. And then the Home Office briefed that it hadn't been consulted about it, undermining what was quite a quite considerable achievement. And really, the government needs to get its act together on the interrelation between immigration and economic growth. It can't just continue sort of allowing different bits of government to do completely different things and pretend that they're somehow compatible.
I mean, just to dwell on this for a sec, it's a broad problem of this government, isn't it? I mean, I think for me the most egregious example is over the prison reforms they're now talking about, where it was such a no-brainer that you could have spent 6 months just saying the prison estate is overcrowded, it's falling apart because of 14 years of Tory rule. You could have prepared that so easily. Well, then again, they are advertising for a 200 grand a year comms director now, aren't they? So maybe everything will be better soon. I want to come back to one thing you said, Catherine, because I think there's an important larger point here, and we've got a couple of questions about it. Were you surprised that this government that has self-consciously tried to adopt a new tone in its dealings with the devolves clearly hadn't talked to them ahead of this? Because you both the Welsh and the Scottish have come out quite strongly and said, how come you didn't talk to us about fisheries?
Yes, I mean, things reached a new low under Boris Johnson in relations with the devolves, who were seen as an irritant at best and something unspeakable at worst. And it is worth remembering that the devolves, all of them refused legislative consent to all of the big Brexit piece of legislation. So I think many people had hoped that with a Labour government, a bit of a reset might include a reset with it's internally, not just externally with the EU. And yet we've got this agreement, and there doesn't seem to have been much pitch rolling done with the devolves either, who will be affected by this in all sorts of ways. And this also, I mean, this goes back to the earlier point that what minimal levels of pre-legislative consultation there is with the UK. Does that mean Westminster, Whitehall, or will there be a recognition that there's a role for the devolves in that pre-consultation process?
I think probably number 10 is fairly cross with Eleanor Morgan for her comments about winter fuel, and probably fairly irritated with Anna Sarwar for various things, including position on the sister dying. I don't know that to be true, but I suspect that might come into it when you're considering whether or not to brief in advance, particularly actually if you don't know in advance what's going to be in the final example. I think you're right. I think the devolved nations are very, very low down the list of priorities right now.
So is that the sort of they're having a slight strop with them theory of intergovernmental relations? They're a bit cross with them, so they're not going to consult. I mean,
well, a little bit, but also don't forget that these individuals can be a bit irritating to the centre.
Yeah,
I there's a lot of, and this has happened to the mayors as well. It's a lot of kind of grandstanding going on, which is not particularly helpful when you're in central government. I saw this is kind of entirely predictable, isn't it? If you devolve this power and give people a voice, what they're going to do?
Use it.
Bash you with a big stick.
Yeah, and it's very interesting how party loyalties don't play much part in that, because
exactly.
Everyone has their own. That's going to be a really interesting thing to watch through the rest of this government, actually, how the various metro mayors react. Jonathan, I just want to ask you one thing about the whole issue of dynamic alignment, because in a way, right, Brexit provided us with opportunities. There were real opportunities. We could have regulated differently. We could have regulated better. We could have been more nimble, more agile, more fleet of foot. We all know the refrain, but we haven't really, have we? So in that sense, it's not a choice between Brexit freedoms we're exploiting and alignment. It's a choice between alignment without access and dynamic alignment with, isn't it?
So far, yes. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that that there isn't scope for us diverging gradually, but perhaps over time, cumulatively amounting to something, particularly in issues around tech regulation. I mean, I think that the difficulty here is that that neither the US model of tech regulation or lack of tech regulation and the resulting dysfunctional oligopolies, nor the EU model of tech regulation and resulting lack of dynamism and progress is particularly attractive at the moment. So, is that an opportunity? Does that mean that the UK can actually come up with something better that doesn't fall into either of these arguably highly undesirable buckets? I don't know, sort of slightly beyond my competence. But that seems to me the sort of thing where we should be trying to do the work now. I think, though, and this brings me on to a broader point of how does the UK make its way in a world, where you have three large trading blocks, but unlike what one might have hoped, they're not broadly playing by the rules. I think it would, life would have been a lot easier if you had three big trading blocks. We were outside, but still there was a broadly agreed set of rules. There isn't now. That makes life, I think, more difficult for the UK. What it does mean is that we actually do need a greater degree of state capacity, not necessarily a bigger state, but a state that actually can do not necessarily more regulation, certainly not less regulation, but regulation much better, much quicker, and in a way which is both more economically friendly and politically sellable to the public. Unfortunately, we're a long way from that. The state has been hollowed out by 15 years of austerity and, frankly, Brexit and, frankly, deeply incompetent governance, and this government really needs to turn that round. And unfortunately, they have not done much in that direction yet.
I'm going to bring you in a sec, Catherine, because you were brandishing a document, which is always a bad sign. But just to say before I bring you in, that you should give, for those watching, if you go to our website, we just did a report on regulation after Brexit that actually addresses in some detail quite a lot of the points that Jonathan just made. Catherine.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on Jonathan's point about two out of the three big trading blocks not playing by the rules. There was a joint statement that went with the other documents. And one of the things that's striking about that is its repeated commitment to upholding a rules-based international order. And in the past, this would have been sort of glossed over as, oh, well, yes, of course, this is just padding. But what is striking in this joint statement is a recognition of the importance and indeed the UK and EU's steadfast dedication to it, with the UN at the core, and also the role of the WTO, and also the role of the European Convention on Human Rights. And this, of course, is very different in tone to anything that you would have seen under the Boris Johnson government.
And does this perhaps mean that there is still the potential? I mean, you said that Keir Starmer has played his cards superbly well in international diplomacy, so economic diplomacy so far, Jonathan, but there is that potential for tension between EU relations and UK-US relations, isn't there? And just listening to what Catherine was saying there, in a sense, I wonder whether, as we cozy up to Donald Trump, give him a state visit and stuff like that, depending on what he's doing and what he's saying, the EU might be saying, but hang on, you signed a commitment to a rules-based international order that this guy is flouting. Am I just stretching too far here?
I mean, I think what it means is, look, if it comes down to it, if we are forced to make specific choices on specific things, we will choose the EU. That seems pretty clear, and that was also, I mean, that was clear in the discussions around the UK-US agreement, where it was clear that our fundamental red lines were about not doing anything that would make the UK-EU deal undoable. So far, we've got away with that. Will we continue to in future? My guess would be yes, because I don't think Trump is going to fixate on anything particularly, that would actually blow things up. But it obviously it's unpredictable, and you can never tell. But you can't plan on the basis of, well, we can't do this because Donald Trump might suddenly do something, do something in that area that would make it untenable. And that's just another reason for saying, actually, if it comes down to it, we're basically in a position where we have to choose the EU relationship, doesn't it?
Not so sure. But Kitty, do you reckon the Prime Minister can get away with not choosing? I mean, he's very keen not to choose.
He's very keen not to choose, isn't he? I guess you just have to question what would bring it to a crunch point where you had to choose. And presumably that would be a threat from the US. They would withdraw from some form of industry that would affect. I think the threat is less likely to come from that, more likely to do with China. And I can foresee a situation in which British universities are told to pull out of Chinese programs, or British companies are told to disengage with China more quickly and more thoroughly, not just on critical national infrastructure, just anyway, rather than the US imposing restrictions on our dealings with Europe. So I think presumably that it would be a security issue rather than necessarily a trading issue, because I mean the US is quite capable of sort of punishing the EU on its own terms.
I mean, let me give you a hypothetical example then, where say we are trying to regulate AI in a way that is compatible with working very, very closely with the Americans. Okay, so we're using our Brexit freedoms to regulate more like the US, but a load of the EU's defense money is being spent on AI adjacent products because there's more and more high tech in defense now. And at a certain point, the EU turn around to us and say, well, you know, your regulatory, your rules around this are so different to ours. There's a fundamental incompatibility that makes it very hard for us to work with you on this. I mean, there's a clear trade-off, isn't there?
Yes, but I think, sorry.
I just think, you know, the signal is pretty clear that in those case, that case, we choose we would, I mean, we wouldn't necessarily do exactly what the EU wanted, but we'd negotiate a way through with the EU.
You're confident of that? Interesting.
I mean, that's, you know, that seems to be the government strategy, and that's the rational strategy, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't, but you know, you can't trust anything that I think the UK-US deal was an achievement for Starmer, but the fact remains that it's not legally binding. Nothing we're going to get from the US will be in practice binding on Trump, because he doesn't regard anything as binding. So you know, you're essentially, even if the economic arguments weren't already strong, the nature of the political game is such that if you're forced to choose, it seems very odd to think that you wouldn't choose the EU if it came to it. I don't think it is likely to come to the sort of crunch you've described, frankly, because I don't see the path for that to happen. But if it were, I think the government has made clear which direction it's going.
Okay, Kitty?
I was just going to say that the UK always seems to pride itself on having kind of the highest standards in AI regulation. I mean, you might not agree with that, but and as an international rules-based nation, I suspect that you would get to a situation where the UK government would be saying, well, look, we're ahead of the game already.
So it was quite striking, I thought, that the government didn't sign the declaration coming out of the Paris AI summit. And actually, if you looked on the government website for the explanation, it was just gibberish. It didn't seem to make any sense at all. So
there's no point, wasn't there, after JD Vance stormed out, I thought.
Yeah, could have been, but I thought it was quite striking. Just thinking for a moment about the EU, Catherine. Do we think, I mean, looking at us, if you were the European Union, would you commit to going much further than they've already gone, given the fact that an election could mean a change of government that sees anything so far agreed just ditched quite brusquely?
From that point of view, I think this deal, or what's being proposed, is actually quite ambitious. I know you and I disagree on that, but
I agree on that.
Given that in 4 years' time, or 3 and a bit years' time, we may have a Farage style, if not Farage himself, government, and Kemi Badenoch has already said she will tear up any such deal. It is a leap of faith for the EU to even hand out some of these things as a possibility. Now, of course, remember, this is not a tabula rasa in the sense that all of this builds on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And we know in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that if the UK were to withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights, that would be considered to be a breach of an essential provision of the TCA, which could bring the TCA to an end. So the EU has already got those safeguards in place. Likewise, it's got significant level playing field safeguards all already built into the TCA. So they've got the weapons at their disposal if the UK decides not to play ball. On the other hand, if you were charitable, you might say they recognise that Keir Starmer needs all the help he can get. And going back to Kitty's earlier point, that if they're doing some of the difficult stuff now in the hope that the economy will be in a better shape in a couple of years' time, which will be the best way of warding off a reform-style future government.
Is it that straightforward? Because, I mean, I remember it was a few months ago being in Berlin, and a senior sort of official in the Foreign Office basically looked me in the eye and said, "You've got to remember, we don't want Brexit to work. It's not in our interest to see a country that has left the European Union flourishing economically, because then, you know, our own populists will start saying, you see, we have a weaker Brussels that will still work just fine." So, I mean, is there still an element of that about EU thinking, or is that a bit passé now?
Well, of course, you know, there are still a lot of people in the EU, in the European Commission, who still bear the scars of the earlier negotiations. And I did notice, as did Kitty, that there was sweetness and light on board outside Lancaster House yesterday. But there's an awful lot of people in the background who have got a sense of deja vu. And so, on the other hand, to be more positive, the geopolitical situation has changed so radically since 2016, let alone since 2020. And I think there is a genuine concern that the EU and Europe more widely needs to do everything possible to try and shore up their defences, and that involves keeping the UK on board.
Yeah, just one more thing for you, Catherine, on the EU, which is where does the EU go now with some of the things they've agreed to negotiate with? Do they need to secure mandates? Is that going to be complicated? What is the process? How long might it take? How messy is it?
Yeah, that's one of the things really striking about this document. There is no timeline in any of this. If you look at the Commission's own Q&A, which they have published, they make clear that some of these things need a mandate. You don't see that in this document. You would like to think that the mandate will be forthcoming from the member states, because obviously the member states have been consulted about all of this, and indeed there was a meeting of ambassadors on Sunday afternoon. So you'd like to think that a lot of this has been stitched up. But of course, even with the mandate, you're into further rounds of negotiations. And each one of these negotiations are going to be difficult because, as you've already noted, a lot of these things come with pay as you play. And therefore, there's going to be a contribution. And the size of that contribution is going to be difficult. And of course, it will be transparent. What we didn't see, what we didn't really know when we were members, was quite how much was going in, and the calculus about how much we were getting as a result. Here, it will be much more clear. You know, if it's going to cost 120 million or whatever to sign up to Erasmus, that will be X amount per student. And then you can see it all playing out that way. So I think there's quite a lot of problems ahead in actually giving effect to what's in this deal.
And if I remember rightly, about the time of our local elections, pre-general elections, so 2024, the Commission published a draft mandate for youth mobility, didn't it? Which the UK government and indeed the then opposition weren't great fans of. Is that what is the status of that document now? Has that been adopted? Is it still floating around somewhere?
It is still floating around. I suspect it is redundant in the sense that it's the big ask from the EU. It's interesting. It's one of the reasons why there may not need to be a mandate for negotiating a youth experience scheme, because they've already made an offer. But that offer is very demanding, including home fees for EU students, which of course are significantly lower than international fees. Just for those of you not in the university world, home fees are just over 9,000. Overseas fees can go up to about 90,000 if you're looking at medicine. And that's an annual basis at 70, 80,000. I mean, it's really significant sums of money. And so you can see why the EU would like to have home fees. There's nothing about fees in this document. The EU also said no health service surcharge, which is quite a significant amount. And again, there's nothing about that in this document. All of which just gives you a flavour of just how difficult even one element of this youth enterprise, the young youth experience scheme, is going to be to negotiate.
So what happens if they can't negotiate or the negotiations collapse? come back and say, well, we're reneging on the security and defence. I mean, what happens if they can't? Because presumably, I mean, the EU has been flagging all along that these negotiations are contingent upon satisfactory completion of a youth mobility scheme. I mean, they've been very clear on that it was a priority. And yet, all we've got out of this summit is that we're going to negotiate it. And equally, turn it round, what happens if we can't negotiate an agricultural agreement? I know we probably will, but if we don't, I mean, neither side has any recourse, do they, in the event of negotiations failing?
No, and the packages aren't apparently linked together. The only thing where there is an express linkage is continued compliance and implementation of both the withdrawal agreement, including the Windsor framework and the TCA.
I'm not sure whether to ask you this, Jonathan, because I suspect I know what your answer. I'm going to let you answer this in a nice, calm, polite way. Why does the UK need millions of gap year students from the EU depressing wages for UK teenagers, 1 million of whom are NEETs?
So we have plenty of evidence that wage depression doesn't really exist in any significant form. So, I mean, the premise of the question is just wrong. We have a bunch of, we do have a problem, probably not as large a problem as that claim makes out, with young people not in education, work, or training. That relates to our education system, and in particular to the large cuts to further education that have happened over the last decade. It really has nothing to do with some people who might come here from the EU under this scheme. It certainly won't be a million people under any conceivable iteration. I would note, of course, that the problem with youth unemployment has indeed got worse since we ended free movement. There's no causal relationship there, but it should illustrate that the lack of free movement, let alone a youth mobility scheme, has not solved the issue with young people on education and training. So it is rather stretching credulity, I think, to think that a youth mobility scheme is going to make it significantly worse, as opposed to dealing with the very real problems that we know we have, which have nothing to do really with immigration. On the sort of what are the advantages of a youth experience scheme, I mean, I would not claim that it is going to be a huge economic boost. It is probably useful at the margin to have a bit of extra flexibility in the labour market that comes from some people coming here, and indeed some British young people going to Europe. That will be good for them personally. It may be good for them in their terms of career progression and what they learn. It may ease some labour market frictions in some places, but it's not going to be a big deal economically.
Why is the EU so insistent on this?
That's a good question. I actually do not see this as a sort of central interest for the EU from an economic or political perspective. It may be, as some uncharitable commentators suggested, that actually because
kids,
the sort of people who make decisions in the EU, that is senior Commission officials and senior government officials in the member states, have kids who would benefit from this sort of thing.
Kitty or Catherine, I mean, it has been.
Well, I remember speaking to someone a while ago who said, and I can't remember that, I think this is still true, that it was the Germans particularly pushing for the youth mobility. Why, though, I'm not entirely clear. I do think the point about the university fees is absolutely no way the UK can possibly match what the Europeans want on this, because the state of the university sector, which I'm sure you're all more aware of than I am, but I've spoken to vice chancellors to say, we rely on these foreign students to prop up to the crumbling institutions. We can't really afford British students who are paying as little as they are. There's just no way the university sector could afford it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
We couldn't afford it and keep paying Catherine her enormous salary, certainly.
Well, exactly.
Have to make some serious revisions. Actually, Catherine, I don't know whether you want to do this or I can say a thing about it. There's a couple of questions saying, Can you talk us through the Security and Defence Pact and what its main terms are?
Well, shall I kick off and then you can pick up on the detail?
Yeah.
Essentially, there are a whole bunch of programs that the EU runs, and that whole bunch of programs the UK will have access to, most importantly, to PESCO, the Permanent Structured Cooperation on Security and Defence. Now, there are acronyms galore. It's an absolute spaghetti soup of acronyms. But one of the things that did strike me about the Security and Defence Partnership is just how far-reaching it is potentially. So it covers things like peace building, crisis management, but it also covers cyber, it also covers maritime, and it also covers critical infrastructure and counter-terrorism, and also some stuff about irregular migration. So it's a very broad reading of the word security. And indeed, this is something that the UK has pushed since the beginning. The other thing that's really striking about this, and I know Anand's quite sceptical, but there's an awful lot of dialogue going on. There's dialogue under all of the different bits that I've just referred to. Now, of course, it's very easy to be cynical about dialogue and say, oh, it's just a talking shop. But one of the things that the UK has really learnt in the post-Brexit world is that because we haven't had face-to-face structured dialogue in most areas, apart from the very thin provisions in the TCA, we've lost our ability to know who the key players are and have any influence whatsoever. So I think the dialogue is perhaps more important than some people might suggest. Go on, Alan, and tell me, disagree.
Some people meaning me. No,
Yes.
that's fine. I mean, it did make me giggle when I read it about all these various different forums they're setting up for people to go and have a chat. And I'm sure that is important. I mean, there were several things about the document that struck me. I mean, firstly, it's a bit motherhood and apple pie. I mean, it's very short on commitments, but quite heavy on good intentions to work together without specifying how. I think for a Brit, the key absence was the sort of a guarantee of UK participation in the defence industrial schemes that the Commission is launching. And there is a commitment to negotiate that, but I think the British government would have preferred to have that nailed down yesterday. And finally, I can't help but think, I mean, there are several different things going on in Europe at the moment, aren't there? Because alongside what's happening around this sort of UK-EU thing is the whole coalitions of the willing debate about how do we guarantee peace in Ukraine if we get peace in Ukraine? How do Europeans take more responsibility for their own security? Big existential questions. And I was slightly depressed by this document because it didn't seem to rise to that particular occasion, if you see what I mean. It seems slightly low-key, given the scale of the geopolitical challenges we face. But I mean, maybe that's very, very naive on my part to have expected much more, but it was my first feeling when I read it.
I think it would be fair to say, if you actually look at the joint statement that was published at the same time, I think there is some stronger language in that about the challenges that the world is facing. And there is actually, in paragraph 8, we restated our resolute condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which is a manifest violation of the UN Charter and so forth. And we reconfirm our unwavering commitment to providing continued political, financial, economic, humanitarian, military and diplomatic support to Ukraine and its people for as long as it takes and as intensely as needed. I mean, I think that's pretty muscular language, I think.
It's muscular language, but the sort of implementing bit, which is these are the things we're going to do to be able to deliver on that, I think. Anyway, we shouldn't have an argument about it. For those who don't know Catherine, let me just point out that her paperwork is cumulative. So she has, she carries around with her everything from the Treaty of Rome printed out in her bag. So with each iteration of these negotiations, her back gets slightly more strained as she carries more paperwork around with her. Kitty, I mean, one of the things that really interests me is this. I mean, this government is, it seems to me, obsessed with the challenge from its right. And yet it's losing voters everywhere. It's losing voters to the Greens, it's losing voters to Lib Dems, as well as losing voters to Reform. Is there a danger that by being overly cautious Is there a danger that they end up in just the wrong spot? That is to say, they do enough to alienate reform-leaning Labour voters, but not enough to hang on to Lib Dem or Green-leaning Labour voters. Do you see what I mean?
I do see what you mean. But I don't think this summit will do that. I think it's wider than that. I think if you look at the list of people who have supported the deal yesterday, for like Mark Spencer's and British Chamber of Commerce, and that's a Labour graphic going around this morning, which you've probably seen.
Yeah.
Like 3 people on one side, Kemi Badenoch, John Swinney, and Nigel Farage against, and like this huge list of other
John
people.
Swinney bit was quite funny.
Yeah, that made me laugh too. Boris Johnson could be added to that side, but still the weight doesn't. I think unless you are a dyed-in-the-wool Brexiter who, likes cosplaying Henry V at parties, then you're going to be fine with this. And I don't think many Lib Dems fall into that camp. I think the argument is being played out by small boats. I think the Brexit debate has, like I said before, has moved on, and actually the migration stuff, and in particular illegal crossings on small boats, is where the attention is now, rather than the slightly techie kind of dynamic alignment stuff, which is, and businesses in general are welcoming of where the Prime Minister ended up.
Yeah, I think that we're getting close to the end now, and it's worth saying, isn't it, that this is quite bold, isn't it, on the part of the government, signing up to dynamic alignment, doing the youth mobility. I mean, obviously it's respecting their red lines and all that, but actually it is. What came out yesterday was I mean, as Jill put it in her blog for the IFG, it was a lot broader than I'd expected. Covers a lot more ground. Do you think that's fair? I mean, how does it match with your expectations beforehand, Catherine?
There'd been a lot of briefing beforehand, and I think we could all recite what we were expecting to see in there. And it was always something of a shopping list, but in fact, it's more like a very long Christmas shopping list, with much more in it than you were expecting. Now, of course, the question is whether you turn those ingredients into a decent cake at the end of the day. And this will take quite a lot of time. But I mean, even just on the Defence Pact, it went far, far, far further. At least the headings were far further than I was expecting.
Kitty?
Just like counterpoint, the stuff that wasn't in it, actually. No agreement on industrial goods, nothing on economic security, nothing on supply chains, nothing on regulatory coordination, and the mobility stuff was for another day. So yes, broad in some senses, but also quite narrow. Not moved on the single market, not moved on the customs union, not moved on free movement. So we are where we are, which is a little bit further forward.
But a lot of the things you listed there, so if you take something like mutual recognition of conformity assessment,
yeah,
I mean, we should fight the temptation to get carried away by all of this, because there are still limits to what the EU is willing to give us, aren't there?
Yeah.
Very real limits.
Yeah.
I think the conformity assessment is actually one of the biggest problems. I mean, it hadn't been briefed in advance, but for those of you who are not excited by conformity assessment, it means the ability of UK testing bodies to certify that UK goods meet EU standards, rather than having to get that certification being done by the EU.
Yeah, and that I mean, I've seen studies that suggest that has actually would have a significant economic impact. I don't know if you know the figures on that. I'm going to go to you, Jonathan, just to.
I mean, for what it's worth, people are saying that there are estimates out there that it could add something closer to 1 to 2% of GDP over time if you actually got that across the board and made it work. But we're clearly a long way away from that at this point.
And if you take the discussions going on in the EU about the defence industrial policy, there's still a fight going on there, isn't there, about what proportion of that funding to make accessible to the United Kingdom, how much of it should be for Europe. It still seems to me an open question as to how the European Union defines Europe, whether it defines it broadly to include countries like us or narrowly to mean the European Union. And I think that's a political fight that's going to keep on going, I think. I don't know what you think about that, Catherine, whether you think that they're opening up their view of what Europe is. I mean, some people say, Donald Trump plus Ukraine is making the EU a lot more flexible than it used to be. Would you go along with that?
Possibly. I mean, let's see how the next few months go in terms of negotiating the things that are there, and then we're in a better position to judge.
Okay, I was very cautious of you. Do we bolder, Kitty?
Yeah, full dynamic alignment, customs union by, I don't know, Christmas. There we go. You had it here first.
Well,
no, I don't believe any of that, but one step at a time, Anand.
Well, as we're now committed to annual summits, I'm going to commit you all to an annual replay of this, and we will start off next year's with that clip of you, Kitty, predicting what will happen in the next year.
It was a joke.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. We don't do humour at this.
I'm not dynamically aligning with your calendar, Anand. Sorry.
On that note, we have actually now run out of time, I'm afraid. So thank you particularly to Kitty for joining us, and to Catherine and Jonathan as ever. We've got loads more events coming that I've forgotten about, but if you go to our website, you'll see all the details about them there. Sorry, Mirren, that was really rubbish. And hope to see you all very soon indeed. Take care.